As time passes, as the wind of time turns the pages, the greatest stories in history unfold right before our eyes. Listen closely, my child. I'm going to tell you about the rise and inevitable fall of a great kingdom, once established on an island shrouded in mist. The Anglo-Saxons, brave warriors, wise kings, and a people shaped by faith. They were the ones who laid the foundations of England, a nation tested by Viking axes and Norman swords. In this tale, we'll see how a kingdom, shining at its golden age, fell victim to betrayal, war, and greed, ultimately sinking into the pages of history. From the peaceful reign of Edgar the Peaceful to the weakness of Ethelred the Unready, from the Danish king's seizure of the throne to the last stand of Harold Godwinson, the last Anglo-Saxon king at Hastings. Each event leads us to the inevitable end, the Norman conquest. But first, let's go back to the beginning. Let's look at the legacy of the great Anglo-Saxon kings who united England under one banner. If you're ready, close your eyes, hear the wind whisper, and listen to the whispers of history. Let me take you to a time when the scattered lands of England were united under one kingdom, and the power of the Anglo-Saxons reached its peak. It was a time shaped by war and betrayal, a saga written in blood and iron. Listen closely, my child, because this is the story of one of the Anglo-Saxons' greatest victories and most powerful kings. For many years, England was divided. Kingdoms like Northumbria, Mercia, Wessex, and East Anglia fought among themselves, trying to fend off Viking raids. But from this fractured land, a ruler emerged who would engrave his name in history in golden letters. Aethelstan. Aethelstan was the son of King Edward and inherited a strong legacy from his father. But he didn't just want to be an Anglo-Saxon king. He aimed to unite all of England under one banner. In 927, he conquered Northumbria, which had been under Viking control, and brought the entire land under his rule. This day is remembered by historians as the day England was truly united for the first time. Aethelstan didn't just unite the land, he united the people. Anglo-Saxons and former Viking settlers alike became part of a shared order under his rule. But my child, know this. It's much easier to unite a kingdom than to keep it united. Aethelstan proved his strength not just by sitting on his throne, but by fighting on the battlefield as well. In 937, enemies from all over Britain challenged his authority. The Battle of Brunanburh. This battle was one of the most crucial in England's history. The Scots, the Vikings, and the Britons had allied and attacked from the north, hoping to destroy the Anglo-Saxons. But Aethelstan, with his loyal soldiers, defeated them and declared to the world that England was a unified kingdom. Aethelstan's victory didn't completely wipe out the Vikings. They still lurked in the north, in Ireland and in Normandy, waiting for their chance. However, the Anglo-Saxon kings continued to fight back. After Aethelstan's death, his successors, Edmund I and Edgar the Peaceful, managed to keep the kingdom intact. Under Edgar, the kingdom became so stable that England experienced perhaps its first long period of peace. The Vikings, in the face of his power, lost their courage and retreated into silence in the north. But remember, my child, history is always in flux. No matter how strong a kingdom may be, it will weaken over time. The Anglo-Saxon Golden Age shone bright, but dark clouds were beginning to gather on the horizon. The Vikings would return, succession struggles would shake the kingdom, and the Anglo-Saxon legacy would face its greatest test. But that, my child, is the beginning of another story. Now, let me tell you about the time when perhaps the wisest and most magnificent of all Anglo-Saxon kings, Edgar the Peaceful, ruled. It was a time when a land shaped by wars and chaos finally found peace. A time when justice and order ruled, not bloody battles. Listen closely, my child, because this was the brightest era in Anglo-Saxon England. When King Edgar took the throne in 959, the country was worn out from wars, but still strong. The kings before him had fought off the Viking raids and pushed back the enemies, but true peace had never been fully achieved. Edgar, however, wasn't just a warrior king. He was a skilled ruler, a clever politician. Under his reign, England became a kingdom governed by a single hand, with a strong central authority. He first strengthened his army, built up his navy, and ensured order throughout the country. The internal rebellions that often plagued Anglo-Saxon kings were no match for Edgar's iron fist. He didn't rule with a sword, but with wisdom and diplomacy. Foreign rulers bowed to him, and even the kings of Scotland and Wales swore loyalty to him, acknowledging his supremacy. This secured England's northern and western borders. But remember, my child, the real strength of a kingdom doesn't just come from swords, but from the loyalty of its people and the fairness of its laws. Edgar strengthened his government by making shire reeves, officials who were the ancestors of modern sheriffs, more effective. He placed local rulers under close supervision and strengthened the justice system. These reforms led to the formation of a truly united state in England. Perhaps for the first time, Edgar wasn't just a strong king. He was also devout and one of the greatest supporters of the church. During his reign, a great religious reform began in England. Oh, these weren't just ordinary changes, my child. England's monasteries, priests, and churches were reorganized. The leaders of these reforms were some of the most influential religious figures of the time, like Dunstan, Aethelwald, and Oswald. Known as the Benedictine Reforms, this movement disciplined monastic life, prevented moral decay, and ensured that priests adhered more strictly to their church duties. Churches were rebuilt, education was promoted, and monks, the spiritual guides of the people, gained a stronger position. But Edgar's support for the church wasn't just about faith. He saw the church not only as the house of God, but also as one of the key pillars of his kingdom. Because a strong church meant a strong government. Edgar transformed the monasteries into not just places of worship, but centers of education and law. Priests didn't just provide spiritual advice, they also helped preserve written laws. And so, my child, Edgar the Peaceful's reign became a golden age, transforming England from a land ravaged by war and internal strife into a peaceful and orderly kingdom. During his time, peace reigned, the people lived in prosperity, and England reached the peak of the Anglo-Saxon era. But remember, history is always changing. Golden ages inevitably give way to downfall. After Edgar's death, dark clouds would gather over England, but that, my child, is the beginning of another story. Ah, my child, the story I'm about to tell you is a cautionary tale about how grandeur and power can quickly turn to ruin. Kings rise and kings fall, but some are remembered in history, not only for what they did, but for what they failed to do. Ethelred the Unready. This name has gone down in history as one of the most unfortunate, perhaps even the weakest kings of Anglo-Saxon England. This young man, who grew up under the strong rule of his father, King Edgar, ascended to the throne when he was just a child. But sadly, he remained a child not just in age, but in mind as well. The nickname Unready doesn't mean he wasn't prepared in the modern sense, but rather comes from the Old English word ready, meaning advice. So Ethelred was known as a king who received bad counsel and failed to make the right decision. And it was this flaw that led to the Vikings returning to England after years of absence. The early years of Ethelred's reign were filled with constant Viking raids. Had there been another king in his place, perhaps these attacks could have been repelled and the country defended. But Ethelred, trying to cover up his weaknesses, took the wrong approach. He tried to stop the Vikings with gold and silver. This led to the creation of the tax system known as Danegeld. The English people started paying tribute to the Vikings, thinking the attacks would cease. But my child, know this: if you give a thirsty warrior gold, he'll come back the next day asking for more. When Ethelred realized this tribute system wasn't working, he made a dreadful decision. On November 13th, 1002, on St. Brice's Day, he ordered the massacre of all Danes living in England. Men, women, children, no one was spared from the Viking population in the land. Even Gunhilde, the sister of King Swin Forkbeard of Denmark, was killed in this massacre. And here, my child, lies one of history's greatest lessons. A weak king, in trying to correct his mistakes, makes even greater ones. This massacre was a call to war for the Vikings. Svein Forkbeard swore to take England by force, and years of bloody struggle began. By 1013, Danish armies invaded England. The people no longer trusted Ethelred. Even London fell to the Vikings, and Ethelred was forced to flee the country to Normandy. And so, England's ruler was officially a Dane, Svein Forkbeard. Svein Forkbeard declared his victory. England was no longer an Anglo-Saxon kingdom, but a land under Danish control. However, Svein's reign didn't last long. After only a few months on the throne, he died in 1014. With his death, his son Canute was expected to take the throne, but the Anglo-Saxon nobles called Ethelred back. Ethelred returned from Normandy, but this didn't mean England was truly reunited. In 1016, Svein's son Canute returned with a large army. Ethelred's son Edmund Ironside fought bravely against the Vikings, but this struggle didn't last. Edmund died within the same year, and Canute became the sole ruler of England. Canute. Ah, my child. He became one of the strongest rulers Anglo-Saxon England ever saw. The Vikings, who once came as raiders, were now united under a king who ruled England with justice and an iron fist. But Canute wasn't just king of England, but also of Denmark and Norway, and so the North Sea Empire was born. Under his rule, a balance was struck between the Vikings and Anglo-Saxons. Canute supported Christianity, made great donations to the church, and won the support of the people. He didn't act as an invader, but as a true ruler. But, my child, like all great kings, Canute's time came to an end. When he died in 1035, he left behind a powerful yet fragile kingdom. His son Harthacnut couldn't carry his father's legacy, and within a few years, Danish control began to crumble. By 1042, the Danish dynasty was completely erased from England, and the Anglo-Saxons took the throne once more. But remember, while the Vikings may have retreated, England's fate was still uncertain. A new threat was rising in Normandy. Ethelred's son, Edward the Confessor, who was born in Normandy, was set to take the throne. And his reign would bring England to the brink of one of history's greatest conquests. But that, my child, is the beginning of another story. Ah, my child, after the Anglo-Saxon kings were swept away by the Viking storm, who could have foreseen that a prince who once fled his homeland would one day return to claim the throne? Edward the Confessor, or Edward the Saint, rose with such a fate. Yet you must understand, his reign was not marked by great battles, but by quietly growing tensions, betrayals, and signs of an approaching storm. The tale I am about to tell is not just the story of one king, but the story of the last great ruler of Anglo-Saxon England. When the great Viking king Canute died in 1035, the vast empire he had built began to fragment. His sons fought for the throne, and the English people had grown tired of Danish rule. Finally, in 1042, with the death of the last Danish king, Harthacnut, the people turned their gaze back to the old Anglo-Saxon dynasty. The man they invited to the throne was Edward, who had spent his years in exile in Normandy. Edward, the son of Ethelred the Unready, had fled as a child from the Viking invasions, spending much of his youth in the court of Normandy. Though he was of Anglo-Saxon descent, his mind and culture were shaped by the influence of Normandy. But with the support of the people and the nobility, in 1042, Edward was crowned the new ruler of England. In the early years of Edward's reign, the influence of the Anglo-Saxon nobility began to grow. The Godwin family, in particular, gained great power in the kingdom. Godwin, the Earl of Wessex, was the most powerful man in the land and had played a crucial role in Edward's ascent to the throne. However, this would later lead to a great internal conflict. Edward was not a warrior king, he was deeply religious. a king who gave great support to the church and valued sanctity above all. As a result, church reforms flourished during his reign. Monasteries were supported more than ever, monks gained more power, and the episcopate was reorganized. Yet perhaps Edward's greatest legacy was the construction of Westminster Abbey. Ah, my child, if you look at the grandeur of that magnificent building today, you will see it as one of the last great achievements of the Anglo-Saxon kings. Construction began in 1045 and was completed in 1065. This great cathedral symbolized both Edward's religious devotion and his desire for immortality. But know this, my child, a king cannot rule a kingdom by building temples alone. As Edward grew closer to the church and to the Normans, unrest began to grow among the English nobility. Edward had spent much of his childhood in Normandy. He had grown up there, raised with their customs, and forged close ties with the Norman nobility. Therefore, after becoming king, he brought many from Normandy into his court, placed them in important positions within the church, and granted great privileges to the Norman nobles. This situation angered the Anglo-Saxon nobles in England. Chief among them was Earl Godwin of Wessex. In 1051, Godwin and his family protested Edward's close relationship with the Normans, but Edward made a decisive move, exiling the Godwin family. Now, Norman influence over England had strengthened even further, but this was only temporary. In 1052, Godwin returned, gathered great support, and forced Edward to a difficult position. The Anglo-Saxon nobles pressured the king to expel Norman advisors from the court. After this event, Edward seemed to reduce his ties with the Normans for a time. But behind the scenes, he never truly severed those connections. And it was these very ties that would lay the groundwork for an event that would change the course of English history forever. Ah, here comes the great problem, my child. When a king leaves no heir behind, the land will be torn apart in a bloody struggle for the throne. Edward had no children for many years. He was married to Edith Godwin, but their union produced no heirs. Some say this was because Edward desired a completely religious life, while others claim he avoided having an heir due to his hatred of Edith's family, the Godwins. Whatever the reason, by the 1060s, it seemed England's throne would be left vacant. This uncertainty led many to claim the throne for themselves. Edward's cousin, Duke William of Normandy, claimed that Edward had promised him the throne years earlier. However, the powerful Lord of Wessex, Harold Godwinson, was also seen as the strongest candidate for the throne. And so the future of Anglo-Saxon England was now hanging by a thread. The last years of Edward's reign passed under the shadow of this tension. After celebrating the opening of Westminster Abbey in 1065, Edward fell ill. On January 5, 1066, the last Anglo-Saxon king breathed his last. And with his death, not only a king but an entire era came to an end. But remember, my child, history does not like voids. When a kingdom is left empty, it is determined who will sit on the throne by blood and sword. And soon, England would face perhaps its greatest invasion in history, the Norman conquest. But this, my child, is the beginning of another story. Ah, my child. In history, there are some names that, though they never wear a crown, are the true powers behind the throne. Earl Godwin, or Godwin of Wessex, was exactly that kind of man. He was one of the most powerful lords in Anglo-Saxon England, the king's greatest supporter, and another king's greatest enemy. But perhaps the most important thing is that his legacy would go on to shape the struggle for the English throne in the years to come. Today I will tell you the story of a man who rose from humble beginnings to become one of the most powerful figures in the kingdom. But this tale is not only about Godwin. It also marks the beginning of the story of his son, Harold Godwinson, and the events that would shape his destiny. We know little of Godwin's origins. Some say he came from a noble family, while others claim he was a man who rose through his abilities and ambition. However, what we do know is that after Canute's conquest of England, Godwin swiftly rose in prominence, becoming one of the king's most trusted men. After serving Canute for many years, Godwin was appointed Earl of Wessex. Wessex, the richest and most powerful region of England. If a lord controlled Wessex, he was second only to the king in influence, and Godwin skillfully used this power over the years. However, in 1042, when the last king of Canute's line died and the Anglo-Saxon dynasty returned to the throne with Edward the Confessor, Godwin's position was threatened. Edward, who had been raised in Normandy and had close ties to the Normans, began to bring more Norman influence into England. From that moment on, the conflict between the Anglo-Saxon aristocracy and the Norman faction began to intensify, with Godwin finding himself at the forefront of this struggle. Upon ascending to the throne, Edward gave great privileges to his Norman advisors. The Normans rapidly rose in the royal court, seizing high positions in the church and increasing their influence over the English nobility. This, of course, angered the Anglo-Saxon aristocracy, especially Godwin of Wessex. With the support of the people, Godwin began to pressure Edward. However, Norman influence had grown so strong that eventually a great crisis erupted. In 1051, one of the Norman nobles stirred trouble in Dover and clashed with the people. When Edward ordered the matter to be suppressed, Godwin refused and openly opposed the king. This was a crucial turning point, for it marked Godwin's challenge to the king and the Anglo-Saxon nobility's opposition to Edward's pro-Norman policies. But this time, Godwin lost. Edward exiled him and his family. The Normans enjoyed their victory, while dark days seemed to have fallen upon the Anglo-Saxon lords. But, my child, you must know that history has always borne witness to the return of the strong. And indeed, Godwin would return. Now we come to the rise of a great man, Godwin's son Harold. Just as powerful as his father, known for his intelligence and above all his military genius, Harold would go on to shape English history. In 1052, after a year in exile, Godwin returned to England, gathering a great army. The Anglo-Saxon lords supported him, and the people, fueled by their anger at the Normans, were ready to rise. Edward, unwilling to engage in a great war, had no choice but to pardon Godwin. But by the strange twists of fate, Godwin died just 1 year later. From that moment, leadership of the family passed into the hands of Harold Godwinson. Harold continued the struggle his father had begun. Edward was weak, Norman influence remained, but Harold gradually became the most powerful noble in England. He ruled Wessex, stood by the king's side, and in effect governed the country. But Harold's greatest triumph came not only from his political cunning, but also from his military prowess. In 1055, a threat arose in the west of England. King Gruffydd ap Llywelyn of Wales had begun a rebellion against the English lords. The wild mountains and harsh geography of Wales made him a difficult enemy to defeat. But Harold was ready to face this challenge. From 1056 onwards, Harold led a series of campaigns against Wales. He expertly commanded the English forces, repelled the enemy, and gradually neutralized Gruffath's allies. By 1063, he had completely subdued Wales, ensuring that Gruffath was killed by his own men. This victory proved Harold was not only a political figure, but also a great military leader. He was now not just an earl, but the most powerful man in England. But my child, power always brings greater battles. Harold's rise would not only lead him into conflict with internal enemies, but also attract external threats, especially from a man in Normandy whose name was William. And so we are inching ever closer to one of the greatest battles in English history. Harold's fate would be sealed in the famous Battle of Hastings. But that, my child, is the beginning of another story. Ah, my child, now let me tell you the story of the great betrayal, the misunderstanding, or perhaps the cleverly crafted plan that would change the fate of England forever. This story begins with Harold Godwinson's controversial visit to Normandy, a visit that would lay the first step in bringing the Norman storm upon England. At this time, dark clouds were gathering over the English throne. Old King Edward the Confessor was childless and his death was imminent. This meant that England's future was uncertain. When a throne has no heir, no one leaves a kingdom in peace, do they? And it was amid this uncertainty that Harold Godwinson made his mysterious journey to Normandy. That journey would become the greatest proof upon which William would later base his claim to the throne of England. In 1064, Harold is said to have left England and crossed the English Channel to Normandy. However, what's curious is that we don't have exact information on why he made this trip. Some sources claim that Harold undertook this journey at Edward's request to inform Duke William of Normandy that the throne of England was his rightful claim, but my child, history sometimes hides behind a veil of fog. Some say Harold never intended to go to Normandy at all, that he was caught in a storm and accidentally swept there. Yes, some claim this journey was nothing but a fateful accident, but someone like William would never let such an opportunity slip by. Upon arriving in Normandy, Harold was welcomed by Duke William with great pomp. William gave him gifts, held feasts, and displayed remarkable hospitality. But was this just a kind reception? Or was William playing a game? Because do you know what happened, my child? Harold fought in a campaign alongside William's army. This was an unusual thing for an Anglo-Saxon lord. Some say William tried to win Harold over, while others claim Harold had no choice but to join this campaign. But the climax of the story came with the oath Harold allegedly swore before William. Throughout history, many oaths have been sworn, but the oath Harold allegedly swore to William became one of the greatest controversies in English history. According to Norman records, Harold knelt before William and swore an oath, acknowledging that the throne of England belonged to William. But what's strange is that Harold thought the oath was being sworn before an ordinary table. However, William's men later revealed that beneath that table were relics of sacred saints, and that Harold had unwittingly sworn a sacred oath. So, did Harold truly swear this oath? Anglo-Saxon sources reject the idea. They say Harold was tricked into this situation and never made such a promise. But for the Normans, this event would serve as the justification for William's later claim to the throne of England. William insisted that Harold had sworn an oath, and when Harold supposedly broke it, he declared it a great act of treason. And my child, throughout history, there have been very few rulers who have forgiven treason. William was not one of those who would. When Harold returned to England, he never spoke of this matter, remaining silent. Perhaps he didn't want to confront the Normans, or perhaps he genuinely believed he had made no such oath. But one thing was certain. William had decided that the throne of England would be his. And now, Edward the Confessor's death was approaching. Harold had returned to England. Edward's health was failing, and everyone awaited his death. As England's most powerful man, Harold was expected to become king. But across the sea, in Normandy, there was a man who had not forgotten Harold's alleged oath. William claimed that the throne rightfully belonged to him. And my child, when a ruler believes something is his by right, he will move to take it, and stopping him is no easy task. The moment of fate for England was fast approaching. If Harold were to become king, would the Normans accept this? What would William do to claim what he believed was rightfully his? And how would England be dragged into this struggle for the throne? But this is the subject of another story, and that story would be written in blood, betrayal, and the changing destiny of a nation at Hastings. But until that time, remember this, my child. History is often shaped by a promise made and an oath sworn. My child, we are nearing the end of a great era in England. The death of one man can sometimes shake a dynasty, sometimes a nation, but sometimes it brings the closing of an entire age and the dawn of a new one. And 1066 was the year when England's fate would change forever. It all began with the death of the elderly King Edward the Confessor. Edward was a frail and delicate man. He had sat upon the throne for many years, but unlike many Anglo-Saxon kings, he was neither a strong warrior nor a feared ruler. Instead, he lived more like a wise man, a priest. He prayed more than he fought. And now, as his weary eyes closed in the face of death, he would leave behind no heir. The question of who would rule England hung in the air. This is why Edward's final words would spark a great controversy. At Edward's bedside stood Harold Godwinson, the most powerful man in Anglo-Saxon England. Some say that on his deathbed, Edward whispered to Harold, passing the throne to him. But the Normans would tell a different story. According to them, Edward had promised the throne to William long before. But history, my child, is written by the powerful. What Edward said, no one knows for certain today. But one thing we do know, the king died, but the throne could not remain vacant. And so, the Witenagemot, England's Council of Nobles, convened. According to Anglo-Saxon tradition, if a king left no heir, the kingdom would be decided by the nobles' collective vote. And my child, on that day, Harold Godwinson was declared the new King of England. This was an unexpected development. England did not have a strong dynastic tradition, but still, many believed Duke William of Normandy had a rightful claim. The Normans saw Harold's actions as nothing short of betrayal. But Harold didn't idle away. The day he ascended the throne, he was crowned at Westminster Abbey. The Anglo-Saxon people believed Harold to be a strong and courageous leader. But on the day Harold was crowned, England's most dangerous year had begun, because it wasn't only William who would claim the throne of England. It was another man, the mighty warrior from the cold north, King Harald Hardrada of Norway. Now, my child, look to the north. Amidst the fjords of cold Norway, there was a man known as the Great Viking King by his people. His name was Harald Hardrada. Harold was no mere king. He was a warrior. He had fought from a young age, served as a mercenary in Byzantium, and become a legend in the Viking world. He was tough, ruthless, and perhaps the last great Viking ruler. But Harold's interest in England was not driven purely by a love of war. To him, the English throne was his rightful claim. Do you know where this claim came from, my child? From an old agreement. After the death of King Canute, who had ruled England before Edward, England, Norway, and Denmark had been divided. When England returned to Anglo-Saxon rule in 1042, the Norwegians were not pleased. And now Harald Hardrada believed the throne of England should still belong to the Scandinavian world. He planned to attack England and claim what he thought was his right. But Harold wasn't alone, for he had Tostig Godwinson by his side. Ah, Tostig, the man who betrayed his own kin. Tostig was Harold Godwinson's brother, but when Harold ascended to the throne, Tostig had fallen out of favor. He had been the Earl of Northumbria, but his governance was so poor that the people revolted against him. The English people didn't want Tostig. They chose another in his place. And instead of protecting his brother, Harold left him to his fate. And so, that day, Tostig began to hate Harold. After being exiled, Tostig went to the Normans seeking support. William viewed him with suspicion. He then went to the Danes, but they were uninterested. Finally, he found the greatest warrior, Harald Hardrada. Tostig convinced Harold if they could conquer England, Harold would become king, and Tostig would reclaim Northumbria. Thus Harold and Tostig began preparing for a great invasion. In the spring of 166, 3 men were preparing for the throne of England. Harold Godwinson had ascended the Anglo-Saxon throne and needed to defend his power. Harald Hardrada was gathering a great army in the north, preparing to bring the Viking sword to England. William, meanwhile, awaited the opportunity to take revenge on Harold for what he considered betrayal. And my child, soon, the bloodiest year in English history would begin. As Harald Hardrada and Tostig set out to invade England, Harold Godwinson would be faced with a monumental decision. But that decision, my child, is the subject of another story. The war is coming, and when war begins, neither the throne nor bloodshed can remain protected. My child, history is sometimes written by war, sometimes by the words of an emperor. But Stamford Bridge will be remembered as the day when two destinies collided. That day, swords spoke in the north of England, rivers of blood flowed, and the last great Viking king fell to the earth. This story begins with Harold Godwinson's long and deadly march. Since Harold became king, he had been forced to fight to keep England united. And now he learned that King Harald Hardrada of Norway and his own brother Tostig Godwinson were invading England. This betrayal was not only a war against England, but also against Harold's own blood. Harald Hardrada and Tostig had taken control of York in central England, forcing the northern nobles to kneel. For the English, it felt like the return of the old Viking invasions. Harold, like his ancestors, wanted to rule with his sword, but Harold Godwinson was determined to stop them. He had to make a quick decision, and he gathered his Anglo-Saxon army. But here was the critical detail. Much of Harold's army was stationed in the south, waiting for a possible invasion from Normandy. Harold set off north with only a fraction of his forces, beginning a deadly march. And so began one of the most remarkable marches in history. In just 4 days, Harold covered nearly 320 kilometers. On horseback with his soldiers, he traveled day and night. This was an incredible speed. Under normal circumstances, such a march would have taken weeks, but Harold had no time. Time was his greatest enemy. Harald Hardrada and Tostig were not expecting the English army to arrive so soon. They believed they had already won. In fact, some of the Vikings had even set up camp without their armor. But Harold and his army appeared suddenly, and on that day the golden age of the Vikings came to an end. As the sun rose over the cold English morning, the Vikings were lightly armored and unprepared. They thought they had come for a surrender meeting, not a great battle. But when they saw the Anglo-Saxon army and the determination in Harold's eyes, they realized this would be the final battle. Harald Hardrada took a deep breath. The Viking blood was boiling in him for one last time. He was a king, and a king either wins or dies by the sword. Now, my child, history books speak of a legend that occurred at Stamford Bridge. It is said that one Viking held the bridge alone, stopping the English army for hours. This man's name is not recorded in history, but his story is told in the sagas. He carried a large axe and stood by the riverbank. The English charged him, but he defeated each one that came at him. It is said he killed over 40 men. None could pass him, until one English soldier swam secretly beneath the water and drove a spear into the Viking's back. And in that moment the bridge fell. For the Vikings, death was near. Harald Hardrada was at the front, his bright blue armor gleaming, his long spear in hand. He was one of the greatest Viking warriors. He had won many battles before. But this battle would be his last. Harold charged towards the English lines, shouting to rally his men. He moved across the battlefield like a giant. He struck down many of his enemies with his spear. But then an English arrow struck his throat. Harald Hardrada staggered for a moment. He looked up at the sky, thinking of all the battles he had seen in his life. Then he fell to his knees and collapsed to the ground. And in that moment the Viking age came to an end. Tostig Godwinson also died on the battlefield. Harold showed no mercy to his own brother. The price of betrayal was paid in blood. As night fell, Stamford Bridge was filled with corpses. The English had won, but the cost had been high. Harold's men were exhausted, worn out, and covered in the marks of battle, but most of all, they were still drunk on victory, because England had won its final battle against the Vikings. The Vikings would never again attempt to conquer England. On that day, the the Viking dream of ruling England came to an end. But my child, history sometimes strikes like a slap in the face. Harold and his men had won, but the war was not over. The greatest enemy of this war had not yet arrived. While Harold and his army destroyed the last of the Vikings at Stamford Bridge, to the south, Duke William of Normandy was preparing a great fleet, and soon Harold would face his greatest test. Now, my child, Stamford Bridge was the beginning of the end for the Vikings, but for Harold, it was the first step on the road to his death, because just 3 weeks later, another battle would begin, one that would be etched in golden letters into history, the Battle of Hastings. But that story, my child, will be told another time. Now, rest, for the next battle is fast approaching. Ah, my child, history is sometimes like a storm. Years of gathering winds finally unleash with such fury on a dark night that the course of everything is changed. The year 1066 was one in which the fate hanging over England grew heavier like a gathering storm cloud. And from that storm, the force that would come was the invasion led by William of Normandy. At the time, the Duchy of Normandy in northern France was a powerful and influential region. But its leader, William, had a far greater ambition. He did not just want to be a duke, he wanted to be a king. And in his eyes, England was the land where he would claim his throne. But before all of this, my child, much had happened. After the death of Edward the Confessor, a battle for the throne of England had begun. Harold Godwinson, with the support of Anglo-Saxon nobles, had claimed the crown, but William, believing he had a rightful claim to the throne, was determined. He had sworn to fight for that crown, to conquer England. William considered himself the legitimate heir, claiming that Harold had sworn allegiance to him and agreed to recognize him as King of England. But when Harold took the crown, it infuriated William, and his plans for an invasion of England were set into motion. William's preparations were the prelude to a great war. He declared himself a warrior of God, and to validate this claim, he gained the support of the papacy. The Pope, by giving William divine legitimacy, backed his cause. William's army was perfectly equipped, disciplined, and determined. Finally, towards the end of the summer of 1066, William's fleet set sail from Normandy's ports. Thousands of ships and hundreds of soldiers embarked on a journey across the sea to England. The fleet was filled with heavily armored warriors, archers, engineers, and countless other soldiers. But for William, the hardest part was the storm that followed. This storm could have destroyed much of the Norman fleet, but William was protected by God. And at last, on September 25, 1066, William and his army reached the southern coast of England at Pevensey. The coast was surrounded by crumbling stones and old walls. On that day, the winds calmed, the sea was still, and William's army set foot on English soil. England was slowly but surely being occupied. William was determined to conquer the land awaiting him, to crush England's limited power, and to wage his final battle for the crown. On that day, the sound of William and his army's footsteps was not the only echo in Pevensey, because when William's feet first touched English soil, it was not just the beginning of a battle, it was the foundation of a kingdom that would last for centuries. The landing at Pevensey marked a turning point for England, a signal of both an end and a new beginning. With the Vikings vanishing into the depths of history, now the Normans began their conquest of England. But, my child, sometimes the beginning of a great catastrophe comes quietly. England at that time was a country in chaos. Harold Godwinson had won at Stamford Bridge in the north, but he was unaware of the other catastrophe waiting for him. For William's army in Normandy was now waiting to invade the southern coast of England. The Anglo-Saxon nobility in England didn't know what to do. Harold's army was tired, the losses were heavy, but there was also a wave of internal rebellion and doubt. And now, everything was just a waiting game as Harold prepared to face William in the south. But it was a move too late. How ready was Harold to fight the Normans? The number of his enemies, the strength of William's army, and the state of morale among the soldiers made Harold's decisions more difficult than ever. Harold's military presence in the south was insufficient to withstand the rapid advance of the Normans. William was at the southern shores of England, and even after Harold's victory in the north, he would soon face an incredibly difficult decision about the future of his country. When Harold first faced the threat of the Normans, all his attention turned to the Southern War. He had to make a final move to win against the Normans, because William was the great threat Harold was now facing on the southern coast. And my child, William's departure was the first step into this great struggle. The next great battle would break out at Hastings, and in a moment that would change the course of history, the Anglo-Saxons and Normans would face each other. Until that day, William's stormy sea journey and landing at Pevensey were just the beginning. Harold's story would continue through the final stages of this battle, but those days are fast approaching. Ah, my child, sometimes history flows like a river, with turning points occurring in the briefest of moments. The entire past of a country can be overturned in an instant. October 14, 1066 was one of the darkest yet most defining days in England's history. The Battle of Hastings would be the last stand of the Anglo-Saxons, and the moment that would open the doors of victory for the Normans. But my child, it didn't happen all at once. Harold Godwinson, after his battle against the Viking threat at Stamford Bridge in the north, was exhausted. He rushed back to the south to face William's Norman army, but his forces were weary, battle-weary, and morale was low. Harold was about to engage in one final battle to defend the English throne, but this battle would be a point in history where fate had already woven its web. Victory would not be his, but defeat would. William, on the other hand, had never stood idle. He was prepared. His disciplined and powerful army, experienced soldiers, and well-organized troops gave him a tactical advantage over the Anglo-Saxons. Every part of his army, every soldier, served a clear purpose. Every step of the battle was carefully calculated by William. Harold, however, was making only one last move, and it would turn out to be his greatest mistake. William was brave and determined. He knew what he was fighting for. He saw himself as a rightful and legitimate king. Harold, however, was only fighting to defend his land. It was a fight for his homeland, but sadly, that defense would not end in victory. As the battle began, my child, it started with a spark of hope, but it quickly turned into a dark shadow. Harold's forces were exhausted from fighting the Normans before. William, however, had positioned every part of his army in perfect order. More soldiers, more archers, more cavalry. Everything was meticulously planned. He sought not just a military victory, but a victory that would shape the future of a kingdom, a nation. As the day wore on, my child, the battle began to tilt in William's favor. The Norman tactics became more apparent against Harold's fatigued forces. William's archers struck like arrows into Harold's heart. The superior aim of the Norman archers began to slowly encircle the Anglo-Saxon lines. But that was just the beginning. In the middle of the battle, Harold, surrounded by his soldiers, came face to face with death. William was orchestrating every moment with great precision. And then, my child, an arrow struck Harold. It was this arrow that would bring down a once great leader in his final fight for the throne. Harold had given everything, but fate would overcome him. The arrow struck Harold's eye, and from that moment on, the last stand of the Anglo-Saxons was broken. Harold's death marked the final turning point for England. The Anglo-Saxons, realizing the end of an era, recognized that a new age had begun. With Harold's death, everything that meant independence, land, and culture for the Anglo-Saxons began to collapse rapidly. And now, William was not just a duke, but a king. The Normans had used the weaknesses and vulnerabilities of the Anglo-Saxons to conquer England. This conquest would reshape everything. After Harold's death, William began his march toward London. People began submitting to him, surrendering to him, and Norman rule was imposed on cities and villages. London would become the capital of the new Norman government. William's ascension to the throne, my child, wasn't just a victory. It marked the end of one era and the birth of a new world. He had not only won a military victory, he had established his own government and laid the foundations for a new order. England was now in the hands of the Normans. After declaring himself king, William put an end to the Anglo-Saxon nobility. He systematically eliminated the native nobles, establishing a new and powerful Norman feudal system. Lands and power were given to Norman lords. The feudal system was brought to England. Land was distributed in exchange for loyalty and service. The Normans established their own order and government in place of the Anglo-Saxons. This feudal system would change not just the land, but the entire social fabric of England. The deep divisions between peasants, serfs, and nobles would shape the new governance of the Norman regime, creating a world where everything was turned upside down. And my child, this is where it ends. The Battle of Hastings was not just a battle. It was the end of an era and the beginning of a new age. The history of the Anglo-Saxons was pushed aside by the Normans, and a new order, a new government took root in England. William's rise to the throne laid the foundations for a system that would eventually change everything. But know this, my child, history never moves in a single line. A victory, a loss, a beginning, an end, they are all interconnected, and each moment in history carries the shadow of the past as it builds toward the future.